Cliff Burton gets a phone call at 2:47 a.m. that makes his blood turn to ice. It's Tommy. His childhood friend's voice whispers through the receiver. The doctors say I have maybe 6 weeks. What happens next doesn't just show the world who Cliff Burton really was beneath the leather and long hair. It proves that some friendships are stronger than death itself. Castro Valley, California. March 1986. Cliff Burton is at the peak of his career. Master of Puppets has just been released to universal critical acclaim, establishing Metallica as the most important metal band on the planet. Rolling Stone called it the album that proves metal can be art. The New York Times described Cliff's bass work as revolutionary. MTV is playing their videos in heavy rotation. They're selling out arenas across America, with fans camping outside venues for days just to get tickets. But none of that matters now. Because Tommy Rodriguez, the kid who taught Cliff how to play his first bass line, who stood by him through every rejection and failure, who believed in his dreams when no one else did, is dying. And he's dying alone. Tommy and Cliff have been best friends since they were 7 years old, growing up 3 houses apart on the same tree-lined street in Castro Valley. They met on the first day of 2nd grade, when Tommy punched a bigger kid who was making fun of Cliff's hand-me-down clothes and thick glasses. "Nobody messes with my neighbor," Tommy had said. His small fists still clenched, his nose bloody but his eyes fierce with protective loyalty that would define their friendship for the next 17 years. From that moment, they were inseparable. Every day after school, they'd meet at the old oak tree in Cliff's backyard, a massive century-old tree with gnarled branches perfect for climbing. They would climb to the highest branch they could reach and talk about everything and nothing. Baseball cards they traded with religious devotion, comic books they read until pages fell apart, girls they were too shy to talk to, dreams of adventure beyond the quiet suburban streets that seemed to stretch into a future full of infinite possibility. The tree became their sanctuary, their secret meeting place, their planning headquarters for adventures that usually involved riding bikes to the creek to catch frogs or building forts in the vacant lot. But more than that, it became where they shared their deepest fears and wildest dreams, where Tommy first admitted he was afraid his parents didn't love him as much as his sister, where Cliff first confessed that he felt different from other kids but couldn't explain why. When Cliff's parents bought him his first piano at age 8, Tommy was there for every lesson, sitting patiently on the wooden bench beside his friend, watching his fingers dance across the keys with increasing skill and passion. Mrs. Burton had enrolled Cliff in classical piano lessons with Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese woman who taught with the kind of discipline that turned casual interest into lifelong obsession. Tommy would sit perfectly still during those lessons, fascinated by how Cliff's personality transformed when he played. The shy, awkward kid who stuttered when talking to adults became confident and expressive at the keyboard, his fingers finding melodies that seemed to come from deep inside his soul. When Cliff discovered the bass guitar at 14 and begged his parents to let him switch instruments, Tommy was the first person to hear him play, the first to tell him he was going to be famous someday. "You're different, man," Tommy had said, after hearing Cliff's first attempt at Smoke on the Water. "The way you play, it's like the bass is part of your soul. I've never heard anything like it." Tommy himself wasn't musical, couldn't carry a tune or keep a beat to save his life, but he understood music in a way that transcended technical ability. He could hear the emotion in every note Cliff played, could feel the passion and pain and hope that flowed through his friend's fingers into the strings and out into the world. He became Cliff's first and most devoted fan, attending every garage band practice, every terrible high school gig, every small club show where they played to audiences of 12 people who were more interested in drinking beer than listening to music. When Cliff made the decision to drop out of college to pursue music full-time, Tommy was the only person who didn't think he was making a terrible mistake. While Cliff's parents worried about financial security and his professors warned about the slim odds of success in the music industry, Tommy simply said, "Follow your heart, brother. I'll be here no matter what happens." And he kept that promise through all the lean years, all the rejections, all the nights when Cliff came home, defeated and ready to give up. Tommy would show up at his door with a 6-pack of cheap beer and an endless supply of encouragement, reminding his friend of all the lives he'd already touched with his music. All the people who understood themselves better after hearing him play. When Metallica finally started gaining traction, when the phone calls from record labels began coming in, when the dream they'd talked about in that old oak tree finally started becoming reality, Tommy was there cheering louder than anyone. He was at the recording sessions for Kill 'Em All, sitting in the corner with a huge grin on his face, watching his childhood friend lay down bass tracks that would influence a generation of musicians. But Tommy had a secret he'd been keeping from everyone, including Cliff. For the past year, he'd been feeling increasingly tired, losing weight despite eating normally, experiencing strange pains in his chest and back that he dismissed as stress from his job at the auto parts store. When he finally went to the doctor, the news was devastating. Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 4. The cancer had already spread throughout his lymph nodes and into his liver. The doctors gave him 6 months with aggressive treatment, maybe a year if he was lucky. But Tommy was 24 years old with no health insurance and no family support system. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 19, leaving him to navigate adulthood alone. The cost of treatment would bankrupt him, and even then the odds of survival were slim. So he made the decision to keep his diagnosis to himself, to spare his friends the pain of watching him deteriorate, to let them remember him as he was rather than as he would become. For 8 months, he hid his condition, making excuses when he was too weak to go out, covering his weight loss with baggy clothes, smiling through the pain that was becoming constant and unbearable. But tonight, alone in his small apartment, unable to sleep because of the pain in his bones, unable to pretend anymore that everything was fine, he finally picked up the phone and called the one person who had never let him down. "Cliff," he whispered when his friend answered, his voice barely audible. "It's Tommy. I need to tell you something." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. Tommy explained about the cancer, about the prognosis, about his decision to face it alone. Cliff listened in stunned silence, his mind reeling with the realization that his best friend, the person who had been his constant companion through every major moment of his life, was dying. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Cliff asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Because you were finally making it," Tommy replied. "Because I didn't want my problems to become your problems. Because I wanted you to focus on your music, on your dreams, on all the things we used to talk about in that old tree." "You are my music," Cliff said quietly. "You are my dreams. None of this means anything without you here to share it with." That's when Cliff Burton made a decision that would define the rest of his short life. He was going to spend Tommy's final weeks by his side, no matter what it cost him personally or professionally. The next morning, Cliff called James Hetfield with news that stunned his bandmates. Metallica was in the middle of their most successful tour ever, with dates booked solid for the next 4 months. They were scheduled to appear on major television shows, to meet with record executives about their next album, to capitalize on the momentum that Master of Puppets had created. "I have to take some time off," Cliff told James. "Tommy is sick, really sick. I need to be with him." James, who had met Tommy dozens of times at shows and recording sessions, understood immediately. "How long do you need?" "I don't know. Maybe a few weeks? Maybe longer?" "Take all the time you need," James said without hesitation. "We'll reschedule everything. The band can wait. Tommy can't." That afternoon, Cliff drove to Tommy's apartment with 2 suitcases and a guitar case. When Tommy answered the door, the physical change was shocking. His friend had lost at least 30 pounds, his clothes hanging loose on his shrinking frame. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes, once bright with mischief and laughter, were sunken and dim with pain and fatigue. "You didn't have to come," Tommy said, but his voice carried immense relief and gratitude. "Yes, I did," Cliff replied, embracing his friend gently, feeling how fragile his body had become. "We're going to face this together, like we've faced everything else." What followed were 6 weeks that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed them as a masterclass in loyalty, friendship, and human dignity. Cliff moved into Tommy's apartment, sleeping on the couch, taking care of practical matters that his friend was too weak to handle. He cooked meals, cleaned the apartment, managed Tommy's medical appointments, and served as a buffer between his friend and a medical system that seemed designed to strip away hope and humanity. But more importantly, Cliff made sure that Tommy's final weeks weren't just about dying. They were about living, about celebrating the friendship that had shaped both their lives, about finding joy and meaning even in the shadow of death. Every morning, Cliff would wake up early and make Tommy's favorite breakfast, a scrambled eggs with cheese, crispy bacon, and strong black coffee. They would eat together at the small kitchen table, talking about old times, sharing memories, laughing about stupid things they'd done as kids. Tommy's appetite was poor, but he always made an effort to eat when Cliff cooked for him, understanding that taking care of him was one of the few ways his friend could feel useful in the face of such helplessness. In the afternoons, when Tommy felt strong enough, they would drive to places that held special meaning for them. The old elementary school where they'd met, now empty for spring break, where they sat in the parking lot, remembering playground adventures and childhood dreams. The music store where Cliff had bought his first bass, where the elderly owner still remembered both boys and teared up when he learned about Tommy's condition. Most often, they would return to the oak tree in Cliff's childhood backyard. The current owners, a young family with small children, graciously allowed them access when Cliff explained the significance of the place. They would sit beneath the ancient branches, looking up through the green canopy at patches of blue sky, talking about everything except the fact that these visits were numbered. "Do you remember what we used to dream about up here?" Tommy asked during one of these visits, his voice weak but filled with wonder. "You wanted to be a race car driver," Cliff said. "I wanted to be a rock star. We both thought we'd be married by now, with kids of our own to bring here." Cliff was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid?" Tommy considered the question seriously. "Not of dying, exactly. I'm afraid of not mattering, of disappearing without leaving any mark on the world." "You mattered to me," Cliff said. "You changed everything for me. Every song I've written, every note I've played, every moment of joy I've found in music said, it all started with you believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." In the evenings, Cliff would play guitar for Tommy, soft acoustic versions of songs they both loved. Not Metallica songs. Those were too intense, too connected to the world of fame and success that seemed surreal in the context of Tommy's small apartment. Instead, Cliff played classical pieces he'd learned as a child, folk songs from their teenage years, gentle melodies that seemed to ease Tommy's pain and help him sleep. One night, Tommy made a request that surprised his friend. "Play something new," he said. "Something you've never played for anyone else. Something just for me." Cliff picked up his guitar and began playing a melody he'd been working on in his head for months, a delicate, beautiful piece that combined classical influences with metal sensibilities, something that could have been written by Bach or Black Sabbath, depending on how it was arranged. As he played, he watched Tommy's face relax, his breathing become deeper and more peaceful. "What's it called?" Tommy asked when the song ended. "I don't know yet. What should I call it?" But Tommy was quiet for a long time, and Cliff thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Call it Orion, like the constellation we used to look for when we were kids. Like something that's always there, even when you can't see it." 6 months later, Orion would become the centerpiece of Metallica's next album, an 8.5-minute instrumental that many consider Cliff's greatest artistic achievement. But that night, it was simply a gift from one friend to another, a promise that love and beauty could exist even in the darkest moments. As Tommy grew weaker, their activities became more limited, but their conversations grew deeper. They talked about things they'd never discussed before. His fears, regrets, hopes for whatever came after. Tommy spoke about his parents, about the life he'd imagined having but would never get to live. Cliff shared his own struggles with fame, with the pressure of success, with the loneliness that came with being constantly surrounded by people who saw him as a rock star rather than as a person. "I'm glad it was you," Tommy said during one of their late-night conversations. "I'm glad you're the one who made it. You deserve everything that's happening to you." "I would trade it all to have more time with you," Cliff replied. "Don't you dare," Tommy said with surprising strength. "Don't you dare feel guilty for living your dreams. Promise me you'll keep playing, keep creating, keep being the person who climbed to the top of that old tree and refused to come down until he'd seen everything there was to see." During the final week, Tommy was mostly confined to bed, too weak to eat solid food, drifting in and out of consciousness as his body began shutting down. The cancer had stolen so much from him. His energy, his appetite, his ability to concentrate, but it hadn't taken his mind, his personality, his capacity to find humor, even in his darkest hours. Cliff never left his side, sleeping in a chair beside Tommy's bed, holding his hand during long nights when pain made sleep impossible, playing soft music, reading aloud from books they'd loved as children. The apartment had become a shrine to their friendship, filled with photographs Tommy had asked Cliff to bring. Pictures of them at age 8, gap-toothed and grinning. Pictures from high school graduation, both wearing rented caps and gowns that didn't fit. Pictures from Cliff's early shows, Tommy always visible in the small crowds, usually the only person dancing, always the loudest voice cheering. Sometimes Tommy would wake up confused, the morphine making him temporarily lose track of where he was. He would look around with frightened eyes, not recognizing the medical equipment, but he always recognized Cliff's voice, always relaxed when he realized his friend was there. "Are we still in high school?" he asked one afternoon, his voice slurred by medication. "Did we pass Mr. Henderson's chemistry test?" "We graduated years ago," Cliff said gently. "You work at the auto parts store. I'm in a band called Metallica. We made it, remember? We both made it." Tommy would nod slowly as memories returned, sometimes smiling that his dreams had come true, sometimes crying because he understood how much he was going to miss. On Tommy's last day, he had a moment of startling clarity. His eyes opened bright and alert, more like his old self than he'd seemed in weeks. "Cliff," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "I'm here, brother. Thank you for staying. Thank you for making this bearable. Thank you for being my first fan. Thank you for believing in me before I had any reason to believe in myself." Tommy smiled, the same mischievous grin Cliff remembered from their childhood. "Play me that song one more time. Play me Orion." So Cliff picked up his guitar and played, pouring all his love and grief and gratitude into the melody they'd created together. When he finished, Tommy's breathing had become peaceful and regular. He died quietly an hour later, his hand still in Cliff's, his face calm and unafraid. At Tommy's funeral 3 days later, Cliff stood at the podium and spoke about friendship, about loyalty, about the ways that love transcends death. The small church was packed with people who had known Tommy throughout his life, former coworkers, neighbors, high school classmates, but it was Cliff's words that everyone remembered. "Tommy taught me that success without love is meaningless," he said. "That fame without friendship is just noise. That the highest honor you can give someone is to be fully present in their darkest moments, to prove that they matter, that they are seen, that they are not alone." Then he played Orion on acoustic guitar, the melody floating through the church like a prayer, like a promise that some connections are too strong to be broken by death. 6 months later, Cliff Burton died in that bus crash in Sweden. But the people who witnessed his final weeks with Tommy never forgot what they saw. They saw a rock star who gave up fame and fortune to sit by a dying friend's bedside. They saw a man who understood that the greatest measure of a life isn't what you achieve, but how you love. James Hetfield still plays Orion at every Metallica concert, dedicating it to both Cliff and Tommy. The song has become one of the band's most beloved pieces, a testament to friendship, loyalty, and the power of music to express what words cannot. Today, there's a small plaque beneath the old oak tree in Castro Valley, where 2 boys once dreamed of changing the world. It reads, "In memory of Tommy Rodriguez and Cliff Burton, who showed us that the greatest adventures happen when we refuse to face them alone. That's what real friendship looks like. That's what love in action means. That's why Cliff Burton's legacy extends far beyond his bass playing to encompass the kind of man he was when no cameras were rolling, when no crowds were cheering, when the only witness was a dying friend who needed to know that his life had mattered. In your darkest moments, who would drop everything to be by your side? And more importantly, whose call would make you leave everything behind to be the friend they need you to be?" Because that's when character reveals itself, not in success, but in sacrifice. Not in glory, but in the quiet moments when love is all we have to offer. That's the lesson of Tommy Rodriguez and Cliff Burton. That's the song that still plays beneath an old oak tree in Castro Valley, where 2 boys once promised to face the world together. And they kept that promise, right until the very end.